This study shows that the more plants you eat, the less your risk is of diabetes. The vegan diet had the least amount of diabetes, and I suspect that those vegans who don't eat coconut oil have an even lower incidence of diabetes, while the non-vegetarian, the normal American diet had the highest incidence. The semi-vegetarians had a little bit less. Vegetarians who eat fish, pesco vegetarians had less, and then the regular vegetarians had less, and then vegans less again. Another way that animal fats work to increase insulin resistance and make diabetes happen, or if you want to reverse that, eating less animal fats reduces the insulin resistance and decreases diabetes. When you eat too many saturated fatty acids, it reduces the number of insulin receptors in the cell membranes by up to half. With fewer of these insulin receptors, it's not possible for the insulin to trigger the glucose to get out of the bloodstream and into the cell. So blood sugar stays high, damaging arteries, eyes, brain, kidneys, and energy is low because the blood sugar doesn't get into the cells. The saturated fats make the membranes stiffer, less fluidity, as it's called. So there are fewer places for these insulin receptors. When you eat less saturated fat, you get more room for these insulin receptors. And as you stop eating saturated fats, then more insulin receptors can be embedded in your cell membrane so you can relieve diabetes. I'm going to show you a diagram soon that'll help explain this, but the dietary saturated fatty acids, read animal fats, interfere with the signaling between the insulin receptor and the glucose transporter 4. Now, this glucose transporter 4 is like a little bubble called a vesicle that's in your cells. And when it's triggered by insulin, if everything works, then it goes up to the cell membrane and drinks in glucose, brings it into the cell where it can be utilized or stored. Unfortunately, the saturated fatty acids interfere with this. Now, this diagram shows how it should be happening in our cells. Insulin goes and docks onto the insulin receptor. The insulin receptor here is dark blue, and it is a transmembrane receptor. In other words, it sticks out above and below the cell membrane, outside the cell and inside the cell. The outside one is called the alpha end, and the inside one's the beta end. Why? Because scientists love Greek letters. I don't know why that is. Once the insulin docks onto the insulin receptor, it triggers the insulin receptor substrate to come up and dock onto the bottom of it. When this happens, then this phosphatidylinositol 3 kinase triggers protein kinase B, which triggers the glucose transporter, GLUT4, to go up to the cell membrane and drink in the glucose. This all works fine until we get too many saturated fatty acids. Now, one way, of course, I've mentioned that they block insulin from working is by having half the insulin receptors that we need on our cell membranes. Another way is that they interfere with the insulin receptor substrate, so it cannot dock onto the inside end of the insulin receptor. This is actually caused by, well, the saturated fatty acids I mentioned, they trigger toll-like receptor 4. That then triggers nuclear factor kappa B, which triggers inflammatory cytokines. You may have heard of the cytokine storm in COVID-19. These inflammatory cytokines include tumor necrosis factor alpha. When the body sees that too much of this tumor necrosis factor alpha is being made, it produces something called suppressor of cytokine. Suppressor of cytokine does reduce inflammation. A side effect is that it stops this insulin receptor substrate from docking onto the insulin. Now, I know that sounds a little bit technical, but if you want to translate it into plain English, stay away from animal fats and coconut oil. Okay, that's the simple thing. Also, the phosphatidylinositol kinase and the protein kinase B are all blocked by excess saturated fatty acid. So the glucose stays in the bloodstream. The glucose transporter doesn't get to the cell membrane to get it into your cells where it's needed. In this study, reported in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism in 2019, women were given less than half a cup of heavy cream as a source of saturated fatty acid. That contains about 25 grams. I looked it up to see how much it was. So this is a lot like the students who were given a 20-gram saturated fatty acid breakfast. They were looking at both saturated fats and endotoxin. And I want to explain a little bit about what endotoxin is. It has two names, endotoxin or lipopolysaccharides. The two names for the same thing. When you milk a cow, the milk comes out, but when it sits around, bacteria grow in the milk. And the milk is typically boiled, cooked, so that it no longer has bacteria in it, so you don't get sick from the milk. When the bacteria are killed, the membranes of the bacteria, the gram-negative bacteria have membranes, are still intact. And this is in the heavy whipping cream that the women were eating. It's in most all dairy products, perhaps not in raw milk, but that has its own dangers. It's also, of course, found in meat, chicken, fish, poultry, pork. All these animal products have these endotoxins or lipopolysaccharides. So in the women who ate this whipping cream, the saturated fat goes down into your stomach to the beginning of the intestine, and it is absorbed along with the endotoxin. These two are packaged into transporters called chylomicrons, and those are put into the bloodstream. As soon as they hit the bloodstream, the toll-like receptor 4 spots that there's an infection. There's not really an infection. These saturated fatty acids and the endotoxin are not infectious, but they're from bacteria, so they look infectious. So there's a cascade of inflammatory cytokines. And this increases, as I mentioned, the suppressor of cytokine signaling 3, which then stops the insulin receptor substrate 1 from bonding. Now, I hope that you're enjoying all of this good science and mechanisms of how this happens. But again, it's really very simple. All you have to do is stay away from heavy whipping cream. You know, you can actually get a hazelnut dairy cream, non-dairy creamer that is thoroughly delicious, excellent, and doesn't have endotoxins or excess saturated fat. It's made from plants, beans in this case. Now, I mentioned that when you eat too much saturated fat, as in a diet where you include animal fats, that you have fewer insulin receptors. Well, I wondered, why is this? What happens? The saturated fatty acids actually can die off from these free fatty acids in animal fats. So you can get a 30 to 60% decrease in the beta cells that make insulin. Then you have fewer beta cells to make insulin. And this is why it's easier to reverse diabetes soon after diagnosis rather than 30 years later. However, a lot of times a low-fat, low-calorie diet can really help with reactivating some of these beta cells so they can make insulin again.